In the late 1960s, the Australian film industry was in crisis. Audiences were turning to television programs in part because they offered more Australian content, and the commercially successful screen comedies of the so-called ochre were perceived to be damaging the image of Australia abroad. In the 1970s, realising the potential for cinema as a cultural flagship, the government invested heavily in the film industry through the establishment of the Australian Film Commission for the purpose of promoting high-quality productions. Since its creation, it has been seen as a helpful step to building the modern Australian industry. Since then, the Australian Film Commission has become known as the Screen Australia and has helped fund some of the most well-known both modern and classic Australian films, from The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert to Red Dog. Question: in the modern global film industry, does the Australian government's cultural funding program, Screen Australia, affect the quality or quantity of Australian produced films? Findings: although Screen Australia is a program that is extremely helpful in the production of good Australian films, it still suffers from the Hollywood mentality that innovation and new ideas will struggle in the film market. Of the 886 Australian features produced between July 1980 and June 2011, 73% were released in Australian cinemas by January 2013. Titles that failed to obtain a theatrical release are mainly low-budget features hoping to secure a distributor on completion. By contrast, 244 of the 275 features made between 1988 and 2008 that were funded by Screen Australia and its former agencies have achieved theatrical release. Out of all the films that Screen Australia has funded, the top 10 overall rake in well over 15 million each. The highest grossing movie at the Australian box office being Crocodile Dundee with over 47 million Australian dollars. In the 3 years 2010 to 2013, the proportion of Australian-made feature films produced for less than $3 million was approximately 50%, while films produced for more than $6 million fell from 32% from the previous decade to 27% over the 3 years. So what does this all mean? If the amount of money being used to make the films is less and the films are making more, then what's the problem? Well, the problem here is not necessarily the quality of the films that Australia produces. It's more about how many are created and released. If you look at a list of the highest grossing films ever in Australia, you'll see that only 2 of the top 10 were released after 2010. Those being The Great Gatsby and Red Dog. It can also be seen that Australia generates plenty of films per year, averaging at about 21 films released a year. If the quantity of films Australia produce is high, and the quantity of those films is also high, then what is happening to make the Australian films so many of us want to see more of not reach us, the audience? The answer to this is not very surprising. In a paper by Robert Connolly, a successful Australian filmmaker and occasional lecturer at the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, or AFTRS for short, discusses the problems that were facing the film industry at that time, and his own opinions as to how to fix it. He brings up an issue that is showing a clear answer to the problem we've been facing. The issue is the lack of innovation in the industry and the inflexible way that a feature film is budgeted. The issue is that the introduction of a US film studio in Australia has familiarized local film crews with a larger scale of production. Although not necessarily being a negative thing, it produced a growing consensus that there was one correct way to work, and any innovation outside of this was out of line with standard industry practice. This has driven the Australian film industry and Screen Australia to develop into this more Hollywood-like industry before building successful and experienced directors, producers and actors. A proposal for Screen Australia in the future would be to take the risk of allowing new talent access to the resources provided through a regulated manner, either via checking credentials through the various film schools and universities, or the creation of a team of people to regulate the filmmakers who get this kind of access. This removal of innovation from the creation of Australian films has created a consequence of the quality and quantity of successful Australian films by not allowing for the integration of new talent or innovative filmmaking.